In this lecture, we're discussing Talia Bettcher's criticism of two of the standard models of thinking about the relevance of trans experiences to the concept of gender. She criticizes what she calls the wrong body model and the transgender model. In its place, or in their place, she advocates for a multiple meanings model that privileges or directs or draws from subcultures, particularly of trans communities. On the wrong body model, trans people are considered, quote, born in the wrong body. The idea is that there is this misalignment between one's gender identity and one's sexed body. At one very extreme perspective, one's real sex, their gender identity, is considered innate. And on this basis, one then has a claim to surgical procedures that brings one's body into alignment with one's identity. Now, Talia Bettcher thinks that one of the problems with this view is that it seems to naturalize sex and gender differences. So this idea of an innate real sex is perhaps problematic in some way. And Bettcher suggests that maybe this is not a good direction to go for if you want to include trans experiences. There's also a transgender model. So on this view, she calls it the transgender model, but on this view, trans people challenge the binary between man and woman. So trans people simply don't fit neatly into either category. Society instead compels trans people to fit to the model. So examples of this would be a requirement that trans people take gender-affirming hormones or undergo certain surgeries so that they can satisfy, say, getting a gender change or a sex change legally, or for being seen as such societally. The criticism here is that it seems that the goal is to make trans people disappear. And this could also extend to intersex people as well. The forces of oppression, this is the quote, aim at invisibility. And the strategy then for trans resistance is to come out and make oneself visible. So Bettcher suggests that one issue here is that many people that are trans simply don't identify themselves as something beyond the binary or not binary at all. Instead, they see themselves as genuinely men or women. So that suggests that this model invalidates the self-identities of some trans people, and thus would fail to do the work that trans advocates or trans people would want a conception of gender to do for them. If you do want to look at another article that discusses a gender identity that does think of itself as beyond the binary, then I'd highly recommend, it's in the supplemental reading of this course. You can read Robin Dembroff's article on being non-binary. So I highly recommend reading that. It's not required, but it'd be helpful. So Bettcher proposes something else. She says the multiple meanings model is not good. The two models above, they assume that there's only one meaning of gender or sex. They thus take the meaning to be dominant, which leads a requirement that trans people justify that they are who they say they are according to those standards. She suggests that instead there's resistant or subcultural meanings of, say, womanhood, where there is no need to defend trans identities. They are simply given. So working through what it is that Bettcher thinks here, how we should parse this paraphrase, is the strategy or the goal of today's lecture, or I guess this lecture. So let's consider some what she calls single meaning positions. So here's a flavor of transphobia. So it can come in the form of a basic denial of authenticity. Trans women, according to this view, are really men, and trans men are really women. This can come in the form of mundane interactions, so through the practice of dead naming, where you use someone's name that they had under the gender they were assigned at birth instead of the name that they have now with their current gender or their gender that they are. And then there's misgendering, which is using the incorrect pronouns for someone. So it can range from that to being, quote, exposed as a man or a woman, and then thereby subjected to violence and murder. So when someone says, quote, I am a trans woman, in dominant cultural contexts, this can be understood to mean, quote, I am a man who lives as a woman. So this understanding is not due, for Bettcher, according to a misunderstanding of the meaning of woman on the dominant cultural perspective. Many people in the dominant culture, the media, law enforcement, domestic violence, and homeless shelters, etc., this is just what they mean by trans women. So trans women then are not taken to be really women at all. On this view, trans is an adjective that indicates that someone is fake, or a fake man, or a fake woman. So when you say trans woman, you're really meaning fake woman or a man. So how should trans people, or people that want to be inclusive of trans experiences, how should they respond? So we could accept the single meaning position. That's this idea that there is some single, definite, fixed meaning of woman. So whether a trans woman is a woman depends on the fixed meanings of that term. So trans qualifies the term woman as an adjective as signaling a different kind of woman. That's the kind of goal here. A woman who is simply assigned male at birth, perhaps. Now, Bettcher argues that this requires defining woman and man. And if we take, like many say, common folk understandings of what woman is or what gender is to mean, say, adult human female, or in the case of man, adult human male, then being a trans woman requires altering one's sex. So in some way, a trans woman has to undergo some kind of gender confirmation surgery or whatnot. But feminists have long pointed out that, and we've seen some analyses here, that gender is actually a social kind, not a natural kind. And even if it were a natural kind, we would have all the problems associated with Fausta Sterling's work, the work of Butler, Austa, etc. So maybe an alternative to taking these kinds of perspectives is to take a family resemblance view. So that means that there are some various overlapping features to being a woman or a man. Some trans women then satisfy the category woman, maybe by virtue of certain hormone levels or genitalia or gender expression or so on. But Bettcher notes that the enforcer of the dominant ideology might point out to, say, karyotype, or birth genitalia, or point to the marker on an original birth certificate. So for Bettcher, trans women's access to womanhood, or being a woman, on this view is very far from being a paradigm of womanhood. She's really just a marginal instance of this. On this view, it becomes even worse for trans women who have not undergone medical interventions. So if you don't capture some of these family resemblances of whatever we take the dominant perspective of what woman to be, this will exclude many trans people. This is similar to some of Jenkins' remarks that we will see in another lecture. The problem with single meaning positions is that they don't do justice to trans people's self-identifying claims about their gender. That's really the upshot criticism of Bettcher's proposal here. Now, there's a flavor of single meaning positions that she calls or frames as contextualism. And I think that this satisfies many of the views that we've considered already. So Austa's and Haslinger's seem to fit into this contextualist box. Whether one is a woman on a contextualist view depends on the context and the rules for deciding membership in that context. So this is similar to, say, the signifier I, right? So when I say I, well, that signifies me as the speaker. Whereas when you signify I, when you use it, it signifies you as the speaker. So I signifies a different speaker in different contexts, but there's a single rule governing the ascription. Whoever utters the symbol, that's who it refers to. And so Bettcher thinks that the contextualist view is a single meaning view in that sense as well, that there's this single rule governing the ascription. I've mentioned that Haslinger's and Austa's views are like this as well. And Jenkins might even be like this as well, though I think it's less subject to that criticism, and I leave that to you to try to puzzle through. So in one context, woman might be sincerely identifying as a woman, and in another might be having XX chromosomes. But that suggests that trans women in some cases will be a woman, but trans women in other cases won't. Additionally, here's some criticisms that Bettcher gives. Saying, quote, "I am a woman," trivializes one's utterance. That is because the enforcer's view is also correct for some other context. And this is just another way of saying that saying one is a woman or one is a man will be true trivially because there's always going to be some context under which that's going to be the case. Ultimately, then, the question comes down to which standards matter in the context that you're in. And almost on any reasonable standard, most cis women will count. There's some pushback on this, I think, if we read Watson's article, as Watson suggests that here's a case where you have a cis woman and in many contexts is not counted as a woman. So this is maybe a marginal case. But Bettcher points out that on most reasonable standards, cis women will count in the majority of cases. And we're moving on here. So there will be cases where trans women count as men due to having, say, an XY chromosome or a penis or whatever. But trans women might not count themselves as men in any context. Plenty of trans women are content with, say, male genitalia, quote unquote, but don't consider themselves male or their penises male in any way. So similarly, testing for prostate cancer or cervical cancer, this shouldn't be considered gendered. It shouldn't be a marker in any context for one's gender. And so this is a problem for Bettcher because there should be, if we want a trans-inclusive count of gender, it should be that trans women are women in every context, not just in some particular context. It shouldn't be the case that trans women are men in any context. And we can do the vice versa for trans men. Trans men should not be women in any context, and they should be men in all contexts. So in Bettcher's multiple meanings view, this is her favored interpretation. There are different gendered practices in different cultural contexts. Similarly, there are also different concepts of gender. Now in trans communities or trans subcultures, trans woman is taken as a basic expression. So whether one counts as a woman does not depend primarily on questions about the applicability of the term woman. So recall that in the single meaning cases, the term woman was taken to have some kind of signification, and then we're trying to shoehorn trans women into that signification at some context. So the question of whether a trans woman is a woman depends on trans women justifying that they satisfy some of those conditions. In trans subcultures, it's instead taken as a bare fact that a trans woman is a woman. Now, this does not mean that there are no categories or there are no criteria by which one satisfies being a trans woman, but trans woman is taken to be a paradigmatic example of woman, just as much as a cis woman is taken to be paradigmatic of a woman. They're just two different categories or ways of being a woman, just like there's white women and black women, or women of high socioeconomic class or low socioeconomic class, or gay women and straight women. There's trans women and cis women. Part of this understanding in this subculture is that genitalia are separated from sex and gender markers. So you can be a woman with a penis, and there's no question about your status as being a woman. So Bettcher outlines the criteria for being a trans woman as roughly equivalent to, quote, male to female trans person. So a trans woman is a person who was assigned male at birth, they currently live as a woman, and do they self-identify as a woman? So if so, the person is unproblematically, without qualification, a trans woman. And being a trans woman is a sufficient condition for being a woman. Thus, a trans woman is a paradigmatic case of woman, just as a cis woman is. So there's two lines here that matter. First, do we establish someone's status as a trans woman? If so, okay, they are a trans woman. And then, if someone is a trans woman, then they are thereby a woman. So Bettcher suggests, and I think this is a nice tack on considering one of the wrongs with transphobia. So someone who satisfies the subcultural definition of woman, who is subject to violence in the dominant culture by virtue of their mislabeling as being the gender that they are not. This invalidation is not only a self-identity disvaluation, but it's also an invalidation of an entire life that has been lived with dignity in a competing cultural world. So she brings in a little bit of some of the literature on, she doesn't actually cite it, but her comments here echo a lot of the discussions that was happening in the 90s and the early 2000s of multiculturalism in at least the political liberal tradition. So the idea is that you're not just doing a wrong to someone's self-identity, you're also depriving that person of their culture. So you're saying your cultural categories do not matter. They are not valid. And she wants to continue. There's this nice quote here that the conflict over meaning is deeply bound up with the distribution of power and the capacity to enforce a way of life, regardless of the emotional and physical damage done to the individual. So what's happening here is that there is a kind of, you could say, a certain brand of colonialism that's involved here, of one culture, or at least cultural imperialism, I think maybe is a better term, of one culture's dominant view being imposed upon another subculture. So that's one thing that happens when the dominant culture ignores the views and the values of a particular subculture. So some benefits of the view that she gives is that trans people count as their gender paradigmatically. They are unapologetically cases of the category woman. Trans people count not owning or owing to, say, a political decision as a consequence of best dealing with them as a difficult case. So the idea here is that because trans women are positioned in a marginalized position with respect to other people, and they're a tough case, a difficult case for the category of woman, perhaps politically it's just wiser for us to think of trans women as women. But Bettcher's not quite happy with that approach because it seems like it rests trans identities as being dependent on some kind of political calculus, and she wants them to count absolutely. She does argue that this is not a version of contextualism because the trans person can say that someone is using the language of woman and man incorrectly if they don't include trans folk. And there's a nice way that she illustrates this next idea with the concept of sinner, which we'll get to in one moment. So if someone is misgendering or dead naming a trans person or denying a trans person the gender that they identify as, trans folk can reject, quote, the entire picture of the world in which that term has had its definition fixed, and so not allowing their existence. So the example that she gives to clarify how this might work is as so. So while she might agree that she is not a woman in the dominant culture, she can reject on philosophical grounds the entire system of gender that dominant cultures circulate. To see this, consider the following analogy. According to an evangelical account of sinner, I would count as one. But it does not follow that I am one, even though I might meet all the criteria of the evangelical account. In rejecting the claim that I'm a sinner, I'm rejecting the entire picture of the world in which that term has its definition fixed. Similarly, a trans woman can reject as false the claim that she is, quote, really a man by rejecting the entire system of gender in which that claim is true, on the grounds discussed above. This move does not work in the case of semantic contextualism, so it's not the same as semantic contextualism. Of course, since a trans woman who fails to accept that there are some contexts in which she is not a woman is simply wrong. On the multiple meaning view, a trans woman can say that she is a woman in all legitimate contexts because those contexts in which she is not a woman occur in a dominant culture that has been rejected for the reasons mentioned above. She can argue that the very belief in contexts in which she counts as a man, for example, a context in which genital structure is relevant, rests on the assumption that penises are male, and is therefore grounded in a vision that marginalizes trans women from the start. So once we accept this response, we obviously also need to recognize that the shift in usage is far more radical than the mere introduction of a new contextually relevant standard. It makes more sense to speak of a transformation in meaning or concept than to speak of a new contextually relative standard. Put another way, there are actually two concepts and two meanings of womanhood. The two concepts and the two meanings are related in that the latter is the result of changes performed on the former. So the subcultural notion of what woman is a result of changes performed on the dominant culture's perspective of what woman is. So one starts with a particular concept and then expands it, for example, to include something that wasn't included in it before. This makes sense if we think of gender concepts as determined in part by underlying gender practices and conceptions of what a gendered world is. Once practice and conception seriously change, one can plausibly argue that the concepts change as well. So by picking this model of gender, the subcultural model, the resistant model, one rejects the dominant understanding of gender altogether and supplants it with the way gender is used in trans spaces. So this privileges trans spaces as having some kind of epistemic access to how we should think of gender in a way that the dominant culture lacks. And we'll see more about this idea of standpoint epistemology later in the course. Now, why is this not just another single meaning view? Well, she admits that these terms simply don't stay put. There's even variability amongst trans subcultures. So she says, while we have to reject dominant conceptions of gender, we do have to accept some version of the marginalized conception instead. But we recognize that, in order to make sense of what people are doing in the dominant culture, we have to recognize that that meaning is at play in the dominant culture. It's just that we should ultimately reject it because it fails to be trans-inclusive.